It's going to be live. He's scheduled to share his story. We'll have that for you coming up in just a few moments. Plus, fire in the overhead bin. A vape pen bursts into flames mid-flight. Our reporting begins now.
Now, Shepard Smith reporting live from the Fox News deck.
And we're tracking several major stories at this moment. Lawmakers racing to avoid another government showdown. But even now, it's unclear whether the president will sign the bill. And a judge dealing a major blow to President Trump's former campaign manager. Details on both. But we begin with the Senate confirming President Trump's pick for Attorney General William Barr, now set to lead the Justice Department and oversee the Russia investigation. During his confirmation hearing, Barr pledged under oath that he would not interfere in the special counsel Robert Mueller's work and that he would release as much of the final report as possible. Meantime, the former acting FBI director Andrew McCabe with a blockbuster telling 60 Minutes he made sure the Russia investigation would not vanish should he be fired.
I wanted to make sure that our case was on solid ground, and if somebody came in behind me and closed it and tried to walk away from it, they would not be able to do that without creating a record of why they'd made that decision.
You wanted a documentary record.
That's right.
That those investigations had begun because you feared that they would be made to go away.
That's exactly right.
First 6 weeks ago. Yep. As they were game planning this, a number of people who've worked at the White House before were like, well, here's how this works. So many of them who've lived the rigors of Washington for a long time saw the forest for the trees and said, this is not going to happen, what he says he wants. This is where he'll go. They'll reach a judicial impasse in the courts. Then he'll be able to say, I did all I could. And they'll be able to say, we stopped it. And they all march toward 2020 with talking points for an election. 1 year ago today was the Parkland shooting in Florida. Because of these breaking news developments, we weren't able to get to the tribute that we wanted to those kids from South Florida. We will do that on our edition of Facebook Watch, which will be next on Facebook Watch. I'm Shepard Smith in New York. This is Fox News Channel. Your World with Neil Cavuto is coming up next.
To the last-minute scramble to avoid another shutdown, all eyes on the Senate, where the final vote on the spending bill is currently underway. It will break the stalemate over border wall funding. And the White House says it will get the president's blessing. Then to the legal fight in the offing. Welcome, everyone. I'm Charles Payne in for Neil Cavuto. Why the former border chief under President Barack Obama hopes this president does do more. And former Whitewater prosecutor Robert Rayon, if the president legally can do more. But first, Mike Emanuel on Capitol Hill on the vote that's happening right now, and John Roberts at the White House on the national emergency that's likely to be coming next. We begin with Mike.
Charles, good afternoon. This is a 15-minute vote, so it should wrap up rather quickly, rather efficiently. The big question all day, of course, was would President Trump sign this deal? And Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell cleared that up last hour.
I've just had an opportunity to speak with President Trump. And he, I would say to all my colleagues, has indicated he's prepared to sign the bill. He will also be issuing a national emergency declaration at the same time. And I've indicated to him that I'm going to support the national emergency declaration.
But that national emergency declaration did not go over well with Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer.
There is word the president will declare a national emergency. I hope he won't. That would be a very wrong thing to do. And Leader Pelosi and I will be responding to that in short order.
This bill is more than 1,100 pages long, and so lawmakers are saying there's plenty to like in it, there's plenty to dislike in it. Here's North Carolina Senator Thom Tillis.
I intend to support it today. It's not a vote that I'm going to enjoy, but sometimes we've got to do things here to make progress, to compromise, and to move on. We owe it to the American people to keep the government open. We owe it to border security to listen to their recommendations to fund people, technology, and infrastructure. This is a step in the right direction.
Once the Senate's done, it'll get kicked over to the House of Representatives. Speaker Nancy Pelosi says they will have the votes and they can fight about the national emergency another day.
The president is doing an end run around that. We will review our options. We'll be prepared to respond appropriately to it. I know the Republicans have some unease about it no matter what they say, because if the president can declare an emergency on something that he has created as an emergency, an illusion that he wants to convey, just think of what a president with different values can present to the American people.
To recap, the Senate voting this hour to prevent another partial government shutdown. Charles?
Mike, before I let you go, what's your sense on a potential declaration of a national emergency? What are you feeling there on the floor?
Well, bottom line, some lawmakers don't like the idea because, as Speaker Pelosi says, it's going around Congress. One of the big powers Congress has is the power of the purse. And so if a president, whoever the president is, does this going around Congress, Congress loses some of its clout. And so some people are uncomfortable with that. Some Republicans are uncomfortable with that, thinking the next president could be a Joe Biden, could be one of the 25 or so Democrats running against President Trump. And what if they say climate change is a national emergency, health care is a national emergency? Then Republicans may be against national emergencies after they were for them. Charles?
Mike Emanuel, thank you very much. Well, the president promising to declare a national emergency. John Roberts is at the White House with the very latest. John.
And it was a bit of a surprise that after this afternoon, Charles, because the last thing we have been told by White House officials was that there was no read on which way the president was going on this bill, that they were still sifting through the 1,159 pages. There was a lot in it that they didn't like. Things like the fact that the National Butterfly Center in Texas, just west of McAllen, had the authority under this bill to say you can't build a wall on our property, and DHS was already making preparations to do that. There's also a provision in it that would allow local officials in 4 Texas border towns, as well as one census area, to veto the wall if they didn't want it in their area. So the president saw that there was no other choice here, particularly given the amount of money that was in the wall. He wanted $5.7 billion. He was only getting $1.375. That he was going to declare a national emergency. Sarah Sanders, the press secretary, in a statement saying President Trump will sign the government funding bill, and as he has stated before, he will also take other executive action, including a national emergency to ensure we stop the national security and humanitarian crisis at the border. The president is once again delivering on his promise to build the wall, protect the border, and secure our great country. The president does have support from several members of Congress. You heard Mitch McConnell say that he's behind him. Senator Lindsey Graham floated this exact idea more than a month ago, where he said the president should take a couple of weeks to try to negotiate a deal. If he doesn't get what he wants, declare a national emergency. That is exactly what happened. Jim Jordan from the House Freedom Caucus introducing a continuing resolution yesterday that would have allowed another week for more negotiations, said the president should declare an emergency. And the White House knows full well, Charles, that they're going to end up in court on all of this, and that they are prepared to fight this fight. Now here's the way that they could avoid a court fight, at least at the beginning. The Office of Management and Budget has identified more than $5.7 billion, according to Mick Mulvaney, the chief of staff, that it could put toward, that it could move around in government, put toward construction of a border wall. The first tranche of that money they think would not meet a legal challenge, but then each basket of money that they pull from after that sort of increases the chances. The president was looking to get $2.6 billion as of, say, the middle of January. So if you can get this 1.375, declare an emergency, and get that billion or so that they think that they can get without a legal challenge, then he's most of the way to where he wanted to be, at least for fiscal year 2019, and then can fight this fight as of September 30th when fiscal year 20 starts. We'll see how it goes. He'll probably be enjoined by the ACLU or some other group in a San Francisco or Los Angeles court, something in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, fairly quickly. But it may be that if the initial legal challenge, the White House may win. So we'll just have to see how all of this plays out. We're just at the starting gate here, Charles.
John Roberts, thank you very much. So the question now, of course, is a national emergency the way to go? Let's ask Mark Morgan, former Border Patrol chief under President Obama. Mark, President Trump, in this particular case, you think this is the right move?
Absolutely. Congress has failed, Charles. Congress has failed to do their job. They've left the president with no option. He has to do this to safeguard the security of this country. This bill, with all due respect to the congressman you had on, this is not a step in the right direction. John mentioned a couple of the sections in this bill that it actually goes backwards. And in essence, I predict very little new barrier is going to be built because of this bill.
Well, even if we went with the announced 55 miles, that's nowhere near what President Trump was asking for. The $5.7 billion certainly was just a down payment, ultimately, on what many said would be a $25 billion project. But now it looks like there's no other recourse with the national emergency route. And everyone's saying, hey, this thing could be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it could take a long time. It could be a legal nightmare. On the other hand, it opens the door for future Democratic presidents to, in their minds, abuse the system. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say, let's just look what we have. So I've started to read the 1,600 pages of this bill, and John alluded to it. There's two sections there, Charles, that talk about it. There's section 231 and 232A, and that's where the 55 miles, the only 55 miles they're giving, but they put so many limitations on that 55 miles, like local governments have to agree, and there's 5 areas where they can't build a wall or put any funding whatsoever. That pretty much erases the 55 miles that's included. So we're not going to get probably a single mile of wall there. This bill is absurd, and the president has no choice but to declare a national emergency.
So according to the National Emergency Act in 1976, this will have to maybe adjudicate which programs would ultimately fund this wall, the idea of seizure of property, who could be harmed by this, and who would have the right to sue, and of course, probably most importantly, which court would this be argued in?
Yeah, so Charles, just this week, I stood next to Angel Family there were just so many of them there, representing over 4,000 Angel families that are there, that loved ones have been killed by illegal aliens. Right there alone, to me, is a national emergency. Read the indictment of Chapo that just was convicted this week in New York. That should lay out what the cartels do and the devastation of this country and the drugs that are pouring in. And we could go on and on with the facts, which political party wants to discard 100%. And one other thing that I want to talk about this bill that's very important, Section 224. It actually creates a new level of amnesty. If you sponsor a child, this bill tells ICE you can't do anything to a sponsor. You can't go after a sponsor. You can't go after the family of a sponsor of a child. That gives them 100% amnesty. And we know the majority of sponsors are held illegally. It's amnesty without calling it amnesty.
I do want to remind the viewers that we are looking at Capitol Hill Live. The Senate is voting on this bill as we speak. And Mark, you had this job. You held this position under President Obama. Were you ever, did any Democrats ever come to you for counseling and for questions about this at all?
No. So ever since I've broken my silence, I cannot get anyone to talk to me. And trust me, Charles, I've tried multiple times to get an audience, and they just refuse.
Considering that 2 weeks ago the wall was immoral, and now, even to your point, even if it's not going to happen, that they've publicly said, okay, 55 miles, then is it all politics that 55 miles couldn't have been a lot more? Was it all about just a political victory for the Democratic Party with this?
Look, this is not easy for me to say, Charles, but yes. If you look at what's in the bill, again, the 55 miles and then the limitations they put, they're just going to result in zero being done. I can draw no other conclusion. They've rejected all the experts, what they say they need to safeguard the southwest border. They've completely rejected, and they say time and time again it's immoral, ineffective, and the historical data and facts absolutely rejects that. The wall is part of a multi-layer strategy, absolutely works, Charles, and the facts are there. They're rejecting it. This is all identity politics, 100%, and this country is suffering because of that.
By the way, Mark, before we let you go, who in the Democratic Party have you tried to reach out to?
So I've tried to reach out to several different committees where I wanted to say, hey, look, I'm here. I want to talk to you on both sides of the aisle. I've been met well, very receptive on the Republican side, not the Democratic side. That's a fact.
Mark, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I want to go to Fox News senior Capitol Hill producer Chad Pergram with more on all of this. Chad.
Well, right now, the Senate is taking this final vote on this appropriations bill. Keep in mind that this is what we call a minibus. It's not an omnibus, but a minibus where they glom together 7 of the appropriations bills that weren't finished for this fiscal year. The 7th, of course, is the Department of Homeland Security. And looking at this vote right now, I'm looking at the screen just off to my right here. There are more than 80 yeses on this bill. That is a big deal, because what that meant is that there was so much support for this between Republicans and Democrats that the president was about to be abandoned, frankly, by this. Now, Mitch McConnell, I think it's very important to note that he did not put this piece of legislation on the floor until he got assurances from the President of the United States that he was, in fact, going to sign it. That was an issue in December. You might remember that Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, felt that he was burned when they put a bill on the floor to avoid a shutdown for just about 5 or 6 weeks, and then the president said, no, I'm not going to sign it. One of the other issues here, and we've been hearing about this the past hour here, is what is going to be the constitutional issues if the president goes ahead and declares a national emergency. Now, I'm going to look right here at Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. It says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. That's very important, because there are ways in what we call transfer authority and reprogramming where you can go around a little bit. Administrations can go around in an individual spending bill, and in extreme cases even go between multiple spending bills and say, okay, we're not going to get a blessing from Congress, but we're going to move some of that money around, but you have to get a sign-off there from the leaders on the appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate. One wonders if Democrats would go for that, and that's why this declaration of a national emergency is so important. Here's the other key thing to note. I asked Nancy Pelosi if the announcement by the president that he was going to sign the bill and the fact that he was declaring a national emergency, would that affect the vote matrix here in the House tonight? And she said, we have the vote. So it's going to pass in the House of Representatives. We don't think that they're going to be able to pass this alone with just Democratic votes. They're going to need some Republicans to come on board here. If you do the math, Democrats can lose about 18 votes if everybody is voting on their side. So we expect a bipartisan vote in the House of Representatives probably later tonight.
Chad, with all the focus on the border wall and the political fighting, I think a lot of people have overlooked the size of this bill, but not Senator Sasse. We just got a release from his office. He is a no vote on the $300 billion spending bill. He says it's a monster. It's $300 billion, 1,100 pages, $270 million per page, and that no senator is even pretending to have read the thing, Swamp Thing. Any others down there expressing the similar sentiments?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I spoke with Rand Paul, the Republican senator from Kentucky. I said, how long do you need to go through this? And he said, probably a couple of weeks. And I asked him, I said, well, will you try to hold this up? Remember, they just had that procedural vote a few minutes ago to break a filibuster. And Senator Paul said, well, I'll just vote no. Senator John Kennedy, a Republican from Louisiana, he indicated that he needed about at least a day or so to go through and look for what he called nuggets in the bill. But at the end of the day, everybody said, all right, we're just going to go through and do this. And, Charles, the one thing I want to point out, that inevitably in the next couple of days, people are going to be mining and finding those nuggets that are hidden in this bill. That always happens when you do a big bill. The other thing I should point out, it is 1,100 pages. But 1,100 pages across 7 appropriations bills. They had already knocked out 5 of the spending bills for this fiscal year. So you're glomming together those 7. So, you know, on the outside, that might seem like a really big bill. But if you're doing 7 appropriations bills together, 1,100 pages is really not that big. I just want to look off screen here for a second to check where we are on this vote. We would think that they would close this pretty soon. They're up to a total of 97 members voting, 81 to 16. And we know that Richard Burr, the Republican senator from North Carolina, he went to North Carolina for the funeral of the late Congressman Walter Jones. So we might be just waiting for one more person to vote here. But the bottom line is that this bill is going to pass in the Senate sometime in the next 5 or 10 minutes with an overwhelming vote. And that should probably give the House of Representatives enough air cover to pass this, probably with an overwhelming vote later tonight.
Chad, do me a favor, please, if you can, just stay right there for us.
Of course.
The White House, in the meantime, say that they are very prepared for legal challenges. So what could the fallout be from all of this? With me now, former Whitewater Independent Counsel Robert Ray. Robert, everyone's guessing, right? But the overarching theme is that there will be a lot of legal challenges, and it could actually drag this thing out for a long time. What would the specific challenges be, though?
It depends who brings them, whether they have standing to challenge the legislation. I guess it's a good thing that we now have a new Attorney General, because the Justice Department obviously will be principally responsible for defending the administration's action in this regard. But at least some progress has been made. It looks like we're going to have legislation. It will pass both houses. The president is committed to signing it. He's now indicated he will declare a national emergency. That is a delegation of authority from the Congress. They passed, as you noted earlier, the National Emergencies Act in 1976. So there's no question that he can act in that area constitutionally. There'll be arguments about whether or not what he's done.
Test that for something to actually be a, quote, national emergency.
Well, that's not really been tested before, has it? I mean, there's no guidance in the legislation as to what does or doesn't constitute a national emergency. And again, I think as I was just about to suggest, I'm sure that there will be opponents of this who will seek to challenge it on the basis that it's just a pretext to do a go-around, the absence of congressional specific authorization to build the wall. I think the president, though, has an area where he can act constitutionally. He is able to move certain funds around, some of which I think are not open to question, as is indicated by OMB, some of which would be more likely to be subject to challenge. Yes, there'll be litigation, but that's not an unfamiliar place for this administration to be. It's not, frankly, a place that's unfamiliar to any administration. And, whether those challenges have any real success or merit, of course, remains to be seen. The concern, of course, is efforts to try to do things like enjoin presidential, activity. And I imagine that you will have plaintiffs with the backing of the Democratic Party and certain interest groups try to file lawsuits in favored courts and do some, judge shopping and forum shopping to maximize the likelihood that they can get relief. But, something like this, where a national emergency is declared, I imagine that the court system will act rather quickly to resolve these things. They'll go up to the circuit court, and while you suggest that it, ordinarily might take years to resolve these things, courts are capable of acting quickly, too.
What if it does? We had a guest earlier suggesting maybe some ACLU goes to the Ninth Circuit and perhaps with a pretty friendly, favorable court could get all the things done to really slow this thing down and make it a legal nightmare.
Maybe, but you still have to have plaintiffs who have standing to challenge this, and it's a little unclear who exactly they would be until activity really starts in terms of actually expending funds that the president chooses to move around in order to meet the national emergency.
You mentioned President Trump's constitutional abilities to do this. Could it be argued that he's usurping Congress's role, traditional role, as keepers of the purse?
Well, you could argue that, except that this is a complicated situation, right? Because Congress has already passed legislation providing the power to the president with congressional authorization, not just acquiescence, but actual authorization to declare a national emergency, and then certain things flow from that, including access to funds that the president otherwise might not have access to. So the argument that this is going around the appropriations power is an interesting one, but it sort of bumps up against the actual reality, which is Congress has already legislated in this area. And as the Supreme Court made clear in Youngstown in the concurring opinion, the famous concurring opinion by Justice Jackson, when the president acts pursuant to express authorization from Congress, this would be an example, he's at the height of his power, including the fact that he's the commander-in-chief.
In this bill, and I don't know if anyone's finished it yet, but we had a guest on earlier who's made some pretty good headway into it. He talked about certain provisions in there that de facto make it actually 0 miles. I mean, if you really were to interpret this, and for instance, the Butterfly Museum in Texas, you cannot use our property. Wouldn't the legal system have to ultimately, maybe they built in safeguards, maybe the Democrats built in safeguards for themselves to either make this something that would ultimately have to be adjudicated or just could never work because of the way it's framed?
Well, maybe. And of course, you could imagine plaintiffs, some of which would be subject to eminent domain and an action for the government to be able to build a wall through certain areas where naturally you're going to expect, no matter what happens, that there would be legal challenges to this, right? So we don't know how that's all going to work out. But, obviously, in a situation in which the commander-in-chief, the president of the United States, pursuant to his authority under the National Emergencies Act, declares a national emergency and then takes action, my guess is that, courts are going to bend in the direction of recognizing the president's authority and power to do this.
I've read where Carter had 2 national emergencies, Ronald Reagan had 6, H.W. Bush 4, President Clinton 17, W. Bush 12, President Obama 13. So why all the hoopla? Why do you think it's...
Because there's lots of posturing going around, and it's politics. And so, you know, it's easy. I mean, you know, on one hand, they're saying this is absolutely terrible that the president would declare a national emergency. On the other hand, there's precedent for this. It's pursuant to an act that Congress passed in 1976, and previous presidents have exercised their authority under it. So, like, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that there's a lot of political posturing going on. That's the big deal.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I want to go back to Fox News senior Capitol Hill producer Chad Pergram with more on all of this. Chad, what's the latest?
Hey, we're getting the vote total right now. They have just passed this spending bill, and I'm looking off screen here to get the vote total on the spending bill. 83 to 16. 83 to 16 is the final vote here to pass this spending bill through the Senate. And so what that means is that there's a wide, overwhelming margin in the Senate, and that probably means there'll be a pretty wide margin in the House of Representatives. There's one point I want to talk about. The president does not get all of the border money that he wanted. Okay, Mitch McConnell's on the floor now, so let's listen in.
Current resolution 4, providing for a correction in the enrollment of HJ Res 31.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the concurrent resolution be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to calendar number 17, S311.
The clerk will report the motion.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 17, S311, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to prohibit a healthcare practitioner from failing to exercise the proper degree of care in the case of a child who survives an abortion or attempted abortion.
I'll send a cloture motion to the desk.
So what we're seeing right now in the Senate is there's just some wrap up. The Senate is probably going to get out of town. Senators want to go home for the next week and a half here. The House will come back in later tonight and vote on this bill. I want to pick back up on this point I was talking about a moment ago, that there are political consequences if the president goes through and tries to transfer money from one account to the other. Now, there's two issues here. There's declaring a national emergency, and that's different from transferring money around from different accounts. Keep in mind that the Homeland Security appropriations bill is about $49–50 billion. There's a cap on that. And so if they try to move money from account A for, say, pandemic flu and another account over to the wall, then somebody might say, wait a minute, we need money for the pandemic flu. Or maybe they try to go over to the Pentagon appropriations bill and try to move money for ships or aircraft and move things over there. There are constituencies throughout the Congress, Democrats and Republicans, who will absolutely howl about that. Don't forget that they just got a big increase in defense spending last year. And if the president goes in, even though some of these lawmakers might in fact support the wall, that's going to be a problem for them when they say, wait a minute, you're going to go in and raid Peter to pay Paul. That's going to be a problem here on Capitol Hill. Watch for those fights. Here's another point I want to make about Nancy Pelosi. She kept her powder dry as to what the tactics might be by Democrats. She talked about maybe we should declare a national emergency on firearms. She cited the one-year anniversary of the massacre in Parkland, Florida, a year ago. There was just a markup in the Judiciary Committee on a gun bill yesterday to increase restrictions on background checks and things. She might say, wait a minute, if the president's going to play ball this way and we think we can get a Democrat elected to the White House in 2020, maybe we like this idea of national emergencies. We want to have this agility. This is kind of opening Pandora's box, and that's why a lot of lawmakers on Capitol Hill, in one respect, are very concerned, because it's ceding power from Article 1 of the Constitution to Article 2 of the Constitution, from the Congress to the executive, Charles.
No.
Chad, thank you very, very much. I want to bring in American Majority CEO Ned Ryan, Democratic strategist Scott Levinson, and Fox Business Network's Susan Lee. All right, well, everyone's chiming in on this. We just got a tweet from Kamala Harris, declaring a national emergency over this president's vanity project is ridiculous. We don't need a wall. Instead, we should address the actual emergencies facing our country, everything from gun violence to the opioid crisis. Susan, what do you make?
Well, I think that declaring a national emergency actually strengthens the president's hand when it comes to negotiating other deals as well. We do have to raise the debt ceiling on March 1st. That can be delayed by the Treasury Department until the summer. But if he does declare a national emergency, I think there could be some wrangling, and that could also strengthen his hand in other negotiations as well.
Isn't it the same kind of political shenanigans that the guy who was cleaning out the swamp was going to leave behind? It seems like another gimmick. It's just not intellectually honest. Everybody knows there's not a national emergency on our southern border, so why declare
I
one?
would disagree with that. It's been done dozens of times, but I'm not sure I like the approach, Charles. I would much rather prefer, we've talked about this has been discussed, Department of Defense Section 284 authorization. They have the ability to build fencing and walls and roads in known drug smuggling corridors. The great part is how you define a drug smuggling corridor is actually rather loosely defined. You could argue the entire southern border is a drug smuggling corridor.
But the truth is the facts just don't bear it out. The truth is the facts just don't bear it out.
But I would disagree that when you say everyone knows it's not a national emergency, you know, this has been a national emergency for a very long time, Scott.
Well, there's been an immigration challenge, and there's a challenge to coming up with a comprehensive immigration policy. There's no doubt about that. But to suggest that the people in Manhattan are hiding under their desks in fear of a caravan is silly. It's just not intellectually honest.
But I think we continue down this path, Charles. It's costing us anywhere from 116 to 134 billion a year. We have a broken welfare system.
It's costing us to do immigration work. Immigration costs money. Securing borders costs money. No one denies that.
What we do know is that there have been caravan after caravan, and that the rest of the world is watching, and more families are coming up, more children are coming up. It's an extraordinarily dangerous trip to make. We know the role of coyotes and what's happened there. We've seen some horrific images, and something has to be done. Something has to be done, Susan, for everyone on both sides of the potential wall, from everyone involved in this, from those who are trying to enter this country without going through the proper process, and for those in America. In Manhattan, we're not hiding under desk. But this has had a real major impact on the United States.
It seems if you watched last week, no one's hiding under their desk.
Well, hold on one second. But I'm just talking about how much it costs the American economy at this point. We're talking about $300 billion to process, to accept in Social Security.
His number was half of your number. So
I'm using the one that the U.S. president is going by as well.
It costs a nation money to secure borders. It costs a nation money to have an immigration policy.
Well, what's $5 billion then, if that's the case? Why not give $5 billion to secure the border?
Because that's not the answer to an immigration policy. No, it's actually not an answer to a comprehensive immigration policy. We have 10 million people in this country that have been living here for years.
Okay, we don't want to conflate necessarily, right, the DACA situation with what we're talking about, particularly more recently with these large caravans coming from South America, Central America, into this country, bringing families, bringing children, an extraordinarily dangerous trip. So, Scott, maybe this was an opportunity. When it first started, I thought there could be a grand bargain. Why not? You had that opportunity. Democrats turned down, I thought, an amazing offer from President Trump, and he made some compromises here. They felt like they won. They scored a major victory with the shutdown, and maybe they overplayed their hand. But why not? You talk about comprehensive solution. That's a political term that the American public has heard over and over. By the way, from both sides of the aisle.
Absolutely.
To me, it means like, you know,
absolutely.
When I hear that, I hear punt. When I hear that, I hear.
But the fact is, it's a huge challenge for our nation.
It is a huge
how we're going
challenge.
to incorporate it in a
How do we fix it?
Now is the time, and to suggest that one thing like a border wall is the only thing is just not intellectually honest.
It's not.
So if we want to have a discussion about a comprehensive immigration policy, that's what we should do.
I think discussion time is over. We need some solutions. Ned, what are you thinking now? Because your idea, obviously, that the administration must have thought of it. They rejected it. This is the route they're going down.
It's a bold step. I think Trump's going to make the argument again. I tried to work with them. We negotiated. We don't want another shutdown. Republican senators don't want a shutdown. I mean, this comes down to it. They don't want that. But I totally agree with you, Scott. We should have a comprehensive immigration reform. We should deal with E-Verify. We should deal with chain migration. We should deal with actually securing our southern borders, part of which is an actual physical barrier.
Securing all our borders. Because 100%. The most porous ones are not the ones that need security by a wall.
I disagree with you
but that's all the facts.
Secure national sovereignty, secure our borders.
You're probably referring to people overstaying their visas. Although the most dangerous come through the
southern border.
Border crossings. Legitimate border crossings.
Susan, with respect to this now, I'm sorry, we're going to take a listen to Senator Schumer.
Border does not constitute a national emergency. Democrats support and have always supported strong border security. But the fact is, according to the CBP, apprehensions at our southern border are at historic lows. President Trump couldn't convince Mexico. He couldn't convince the American people. He couldn't convince their elected representatives to pay for his ineffective and expensive wall. So now he's trying an end run around Congress in a desperate attempt to put taxpayers on the hook for it. Make no mistake, Congress will defend our constitutional authorities in every way that we can. I yield the floor.
Susan, I left with you. We just heard with Senator Schumer there saying, hey, you know, these apprehensions at the southern border, they're down. And of course, we've heard the argument that the majority of drugs come through the legal ports. Although it's safe to understand that as we get greater technology there will have to be more and more that come through these porous areas where there is no physical security.
Yeah, I agree with you. We do need more money to build fencing. In fact, they were in favor of that until the Republican president came into power. But I think there's a missed opportunity from both sides. I mean, why not give the Republicans $5 billion to the wall, renegotiate DACA, and then, you know, we have a better immigration system that needs to be fixed.
Want to bring in, we've got Devin Nunes. He's the ranking Republican on the House Intelligence Committee, and he joins us now. First, Representative Nunes, let me just start with this vote and more importantly, the idea of a national emergency. What are your thoughts and where do you stand on this?
Well, I actually agree with your panel. I was standing here listening to the panel. I think we need to have everything on the table. We need to deal with DACA. We need to have a work permit system. That's really what we should be doing, but the Democrats in the House haven't wanted to come to the table. So, you know, they promised that they were going to take care of immigration. This is the obvious time to take care of the DACA kids, but they're not willing to even put something on the table. So, you know, what we're left with is barely starting the wall, but a true solution is real border security with a real worker permit system and dealing with the people that are here. That's what the American people should expect from us.
That goes without saying, I think, at this point, and yet that's not what's being delivered from Washington, D.C., and it's been a very long period of time. President Trump now, perhaps, according to sources, ready to use a national emergency. Sarah Sanders saying that they're very prepared for legal challenges. Where do you stand with respect to that? Because I know within the Republican Party, some think that this could be a dangerous path to go down. It can open a Pandora's box.
Well, it is a dangerous path, but the path has already been down by President Obama numerous times. So I really support this idea because I think we have to have legal challenges so that we can show the American people whether the courts are going to only side with Democrats and Democratic presidents or the court's going to be fair. There's definitely in the law that this is an emergency on the border. The president has the powers to do it. Where if you take with President Obama, even though I'm the person who actually wants to deal with the DACA kids, I think they need to be dealt with in a humane way. But President Obama didn't have the legal authority to give these people status, and that's still being fought over in the courts. So I think it's a good idea because we're paying the price for an administration that went really awry over the last 8 years before Donald Trump became president.
Representative Nunes, let me change directions here a little bit because there's a lot of fallout of the 60 Minutes interview coming up with Andrew McCabe, also promoting his new book, The Threat, How the FBI Protects America in the Age of Terror and Trump. And the most explosive thing so far, an admission of sorts of a potential, for lack of a better word, coup against President Trump. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I actually had not heard the name of the book until you just said it. It's interesting they talk about in the age of terror. What I think most Republicans agree with that, but the terror came from the FBI and Department of Justice, who used a document, dirt, dug up by the Clinton campaign to start an investigation. And then including, I mean, if you've seen some of the interviews or read the excerpts, he even talked about the steps that he took to ensure that the investigation would continue. We know from, I've looked at all of this over the last 2 years. We know for a fact the FBI knew at the time of the appointment of the special counsel from the lead investigators that there was no there, meaning that they had nothing on Trump. They had no collusion. They never did. Why? Because it was propaganda from the Russians given to the Clinton campaign, picked up by our FBI. It's an embarrassment, and it is a terror, and they did try to attempt a coup. And it should never have been done, and this needs to be righted. It's a wrong that needs to be righted.
It's shocking. I mean, we have to really sit down and pause for a moment. And I think we get hit with so much news, and it changes every 24 hours that we just let things go. But the idea that the FBI was doing a nose count to see maybe how many members of the cabinet, they needed 8, would be okay with the 25th Amendment to take away the presidency, to overturn essentially the vote of the American people, ostensibly because they thought he would pull the plug on a Russian investigation. It's so far-fetched, and yet this is real life. This was happening. How is this happening in this country right now?
Not only did it really happen, Charles, but they cast a net so wide without any real evidence on anyone. The only evidence they had was this dossier that the Clinton campaign paid for that came from Russians. And the irony in all this, and I know I can't say it enough times, the very thing that they were investigating the Trump campaign for, which was supposedly getting dirt from Russians to use against Hillary Clinton, that's exactly what the Clinton campaign did. And so, I hope that the new AG gets in there and he starts to clean house, and so that we can start to put the Department of Justice and the FBI back together again.
Sir, I want you to take a listen, along with the audience, to what Senator Graham had to say earlier today.
We're definitely going to speak to Andrew McCabe and the whole crowd about what happened during the 2016 election.
A lot of people believe that Andrew McCabe should be facing justice himself. Of course, he was fired the day before his retirement for lack of candor, which is a euphemism for lying. What are your thoughts on bringing Andrew McCabe back to Capitol Hill and digging further into this, and maybe where he should he be facing some legal challenges himself?
Well, all of them that were involved in the development of the FISA, okay, so this was the secret warrant that went after the Trump campaign, everybody who was behind that should be held accountable. Whether it was a conspiracy or not, whether it was abuse of power, I don't know, but they should be held accountable. The court, the FISA court, should hold them accountable also. The FISA court should step in. They could all lose their law licenses or be charged with lying to the court or misleading the court. Those are the types of things that need to happen if we're going to keep this process, this FISA process, which is designed to target terrorists, to target bad guys. The American people need to understand that system that's supposed to target really bad terrorists and foreigners was used against a political campaign. That's where this all went wrong, and somebody's got to fix it, because every day that goes by that it's not fixed, there's fewer and fewer Republicans who will support the continuation of these programs, which are extremely important to protecting Americans.
Sir, will you have a statement, a joint statement that's just come in on the possibility of President Trump declaring a national emergency? Is from Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and Speaker Nancy Pelosi. I want to share it with you. It's a joint statement. Quote, declaring a national emergency would be a lawless act, a gross abuse of power of the presidency, and a desperate attempt to distract from the fact that President Trump broke his core promise to have Mexico pay for his wall. And it's yet another demonstration of President Trump's naked contempt for the rule of law. This is not an emergency, and the president's fear-mongering does not make it one. He couldn't convince Mexico, the American people, or their elected representatives to pay for his ineffective and expensive wall. So now he's trying an end run around Congress in a desperate attempt to put taxpayers on the hook for it. The Congress will defend our constitutional authorities. Your thoughts?
Well, for those people to talk about lawlessness after President Obama set a record for executive orders and executive actions without any authority is hysterical. So they probably just ought to look in the mirror, because normally whatever they accuse you of doing, they're actually doing themselves. Like I said earlier, I think this is an important step to take, because this needs to get into the courts, because we need to deal with all of the executive actions that have taken place over the last decade or so.
Are you confident that that will happen? I mean, we're looking at an American public who's really skeptical. We've seen hearing after hearing after hearing after hearing, and it just goes on from one administration to another. And it feels like this notion of some form of justice, some form of clarity, some finality to all of it remains very elusive.
It does, and it's like we started out with, Charles. This is really sad that we cannot get bipartisan cooperation in this town to solve the problem with immigration. Remember, Republicans got about 180 votes last year in the House. We need 218. We only got 180. But that was for DACA. It was for building the wall. It was for border security. It was a great piece of legislation. Not one Democrat voted for it. Here they now have, they've promised all these DACA kids that they're going to take care of the DACA kids. The president reached out to them, gave them an olive branch to have some type of comprehensive immigration reform, and they haven't done it. So, and then they sit there, I mean, first time I heard the statement, you just read it, but to sit there and complain about lawlessness, I mean, give me a break.
Right. Representative Nunes, thank you very, very much. Really appreciate your time. Also, to let the audience know, we reached out and called Adam Schiff, chair of the House Intel, and he was not available at this time. More right after this. We got major breaking news just coming in. The United States government and Facebook are negotiating a record multi-billion-dollar fine for the company's privacy lapses. This is according to the Washington Post. That is huge, huge news. And we also have another major story from you from another big tech name. That's Amazon saying see ya today to New York City, scrapping plans for a second headquarters there. This coming after a lot of backlash from local officials. Amazon stock down just 1% on today's session. The results of the president's physical, well, they're in. John Roberts is at the White House with the very latest. John.
Charles, good afternoon to you again. President was up at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center for 4 hours on Friday. A team of doctors, including his personal physician, Sean Connolly, and 11 specialists looked him over, and they pronounced that he is, quote, in very good health overall. One problem for the president, he weighs 243 pounds. That gives him a BMI of 30.4. That's not good. 4 pounds more than he weighed last year. His blood pressure is still fine, though, 118/80. His temperature, 98.2. A lot of people think the president runs a little hot, but he actually runs a little cool. There were no findings of any significance or changes to the ears, eyes, nose, mouth, teeth, gums, heart, lungs, skin, gastrointestinal, or neurologic system. Liver, kidney, and thyroid function all normal, as are his electrolytes and blood counts. He still has a fairly high cholesterol number. It's 196 with his LDL at 122. So as a result, the doctors increased his dose of Crestor up to 40 milligrams a day, which is pretty close to the maximum. But all in all, his heart's in good shape. They say that the rest of him's in good shape as well. So he does remain in very good health. I don't want to say he's the healthiest president ever, but he is in good health.
I got to tell you, though, for all the things that he deals with and compartmentalizes, he is pretty healthy, that's for sure. John.
You know, it's that 30.4 BMI is he's got to watch that.
Yeah,
maybe when he plays golf this weekend, he might want to walk instead of taking.
Tell me about it. I'm afraid to even look at my BMI. John, thank you very much. Appreciate it. While we hug those we love tight today, remembering the 17 families in Parkland, Florida, who wish they could be doing the same. Families like Andrew Pollux, who are turning their tragic loss 1 year ago today into action to keep kids safe every day. Andrew is next. To Parkland, Florida, where students are expressing their love and remembrance today by forming a human peace sign, holding a moment of silence, and finding other ways, like planting flowers in a community garden, to say hello and be close to those they lost a year ago today.
Should have been one school shooting, and we should have fixed it. And I'm pissed, because my daughter I'm not going to see again. She's not here. She's not here.
Andrew Pollock's beautiful daughter, Meadow, she was killed in that horrific school shooting this year, 1 year ago. And he has been fighting to keep his daughter's memory alive and students everywhere safe ever since. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
Just your thoughts, 1 year after this horrific tragedy, and where you feel progress may have been made so far.
Well, I made a lot of progress because I took a different path than mainstream media and the liberal politicians. I actually went and looked at the facts and what led up to February 14th. We looked at it and we addressed the problems, and we made a lot of changes at a federal level with the president and at a state level now with our new governor and our last governor, Rick Scott.
Yeah, they certainly have been very instrumental. What are some of the key changes that have been made that you feel perhaps should have been made a long time ago?
One of the key changes that I worked on that meant so much to me was the Obama-era leniency policies brought to Broward County and snuck in to parents throughout the whole country was leniency policies of not holding kids accountable for committing many crimes throughout the school year.